So to continue talking about bureaucratization from Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, let's look at a couple more quotes. He says right off the bat, let me get my pointer all set up. Right off the bat, that uniform textbooks, standardized diplomas and teaching certificates, a strictly regulated gradation of age groups, classes, and instructional materials in themselves created a self-contained, coherent universe of experience. Again, we need to deconstruct this a little bit. So what are we looking at? What are we looking at in terms of the universal expansion of an international model? What are we looking at the globally institutionalized weird system of education that we have been talking about? Well, Benedict Anderson points out that in this last wave of nationalism, the way that it worked was there were increasingly uniform textbooks. So the physical materials that were used in classes were standardized. They were uniform across the nation state. And we are simply expanding that argument to say that increasingly, at least the content that's in these textbooks is also uniform, not just within nation states, not just within national education systems, but increasingly internationally. They might be by a different publisher or have a different cover or be written in a different way, but the core elements, the concepts, the knowledge that is conveyed in these textbooks and the cultural account that goes along with that will be relatively uniform. Next, standardized diplomas and teaching certificates. So the idea that there were start and stop points in an educational system, and that when someone got to the end of whatever was recognized as a complete education experience or education career, that there was a diploma at that moment that signified they were completed. That idea of standardizing what that meant across different communities is something that was relatively new. For example, now we talk, really without thinking about it, about primary education, secondary education, higher education, or tertiary education. Those moments in time where there's a transition point, where there's a unit of education, formal education that is completed, is something that came with the bureaucratization of educational systems during this last wave of nationalism. So even though what it means to have a secondary diploma, a high school diploma, whatever you want to call it, is going to vary slightly from country to country, from system to system. There is a relatively stable set of expectations. It'll be near the end of a person's teen years when they will generally get that. There will be a certain kind of curriculum, usually a relatively balanced general curriculum that everybody who goes through the formal education system will have had access to in order to receive that diploma, and the list could go on and on. The same with teaching certificates. Now, certification for teachers is by no means a universal requirement. There are many countries where teachers are not required to be certified. However, what is generally considered an appropriately trained teacher is increasingly becoming more and more uniform from country to country and nationwide. And especially now in the 21st century, there's a lot of discussion in the research literature and in the education policy literature as well, and policy discussions themselves about what can be done to make teaching more uniform across systems. And then there is a strictly regulated gradation of age groups, classes, and instructional materials. A 5th grade English textbook is what we're talking about, right? That kind of strict gradation of age groups, classes, and instructional materials. Let me go a little further. If I say that someone is in 5th grade in the United States, do you know how old they are? If you're from the United States, do you know how old they are? Or if I say that someone is in grade 5 in, pick whatever country you're from, do you know generally what age they are? Because I know. If they're grade 5 in the United States, they are roughly 10 years old. Okay? Maybe 11, maybe 9, but they're going to hit 10 years old somewhere in there. Right? That is the norm. And we have age groups throughout our education systems as a way to organize. As a way to organize what the content is that's delivered. As a way to organize the way that they are grouped within the classes themselves. As a way to organize the ways that we make policy and think about these groups. You also have students grouped into classes. Those can be classes in terms of those age groups, like 5th grade, pardon me, or those can be classes in terms of physical classrooms. Right? So in some countries, we separate classrooms by topic. There's a science classroom, there's a math classroom, there's an English classroom, there's a history classroom. In other countries, they separate classrooms by groups of students. There's class 1-1 and class 1-2 and class 1-3, right? And those will have all students in grade 1, but they'll be together in the same classroom all day long, and the teachers will rotate through. So whichever system we're talking about, it's still age-graded classrooms. Finally, we have a regulated gradation of instructional materials. We would not give an 11th grade test in chemistry to a 5th grader, because this is made for 11th grade chemistry students. There is a certain set of expectations in terms of what curriculum has been covered, what the standards are for the teachers and the students in the curriculum at that grade level, that we wouldn't expect from 5th graders. And there is a highly rationalized way that has been developed so that kids in the younger grades get a particular type of curriculum that is probably more foundation-based, more basic than kids in the higher grades, where they'll get more specialized and more advanced material. And what he says is that this creates a self-contained, coherent universe of experience, which goes along with this next quote. And they knew that from wherever they had come, they still had read the same books and done the same sums. Now, if we expand this idea a little bit, and think of the world in terms of two large populations. Those who have gone through a formal education system, we will call those the schooled people, and those who have not. And this is where David Baker gets his schooled society idea. Most of the people that we're going to encounter have had some experience, even if it's just for a couple of years, in a formal education system. It is very rare to find those who have not. And when we have those who are schooled, there is a shared set of expectations. We all know what a classroom smells like. We all know what the relationship is supposed to be like between a teacher and a student. We all know what some of the rules are in terms of how we behave in a classroom. Right? There are ingrained expectations that have nothing to do with the curriculum or the way that we're being taught, although that's a huge part of it. But there are lots of expectations that have nothing to do that create that self-contained, coherent universe of experience. So much so that it creates a community all of itself. An imagined community, perhaps, but a community where we know that we've read some of the same books, we've done the same kind of math, we've had the same sort of experiences, we understand the same kinds of cultures that are prevalent in schools. Right? Even though our own culture may be very different from the school culture, from the weird culture that's in school, but we still understand that and we've worked through it. That is interesting, and that is a result of bureaucratization. Finally, Benedict Anderson points out the idea of educational expansion. And he says that this expansion occurred not simply to provide cadres for governmental corporate hierarchies, but also because of the growing acceptance of the moral importance of modern knowledge, even for colonized populations. So in imagined communities, Benedict Anderson makes an argument that there are these trained functionaries. They're functionaries because they work in these usually colonial outposts of European countries. He's looking at colonized populations, as you can tell from that quote. And he's talking about how there was a need to establish a training program or an educational system to take the Creoles, those of mixed race from both the European and the indigenous community, or those from the indigenous community themselves, and prepare them to work within the government or the corporate system that the colonizing country had in place. And that was one way that we had an expansion of education. But what he takes a little further, he says in this last wave of nationalism, education expands beyond that. It's not just for people who are being trained to be functionaries in the government system or in the capitalist system. The education system begins to grow and expand because of the acceptance of the moral importance of modern knowledge. Now this is loaded, right? Whose morality? What is modern? Whose knowledge? These are all important questions to ask, and I think you might know the answer, right? It's going to be Western, educated, industrialized, rich democracies, for the most part, at least now in the 21st century, that are going to be supplying the cultural definitions of morality and the cultural definitions of knowledge and the idea of what is modern. All right, that's going to come from a particular community, and so there are advantages for some and extreme disadvantages for others in that kind of a system. But the idea that there is this acceptance of it, and the acceptance is because it becomes legitimized, which means that it is institutionalized. We do not question it, even if it disadvantages us. Interesting. He says, nothing nurtured this bonding more than schools. This bonding, I think, refers to this, right? Where everyone understands that they've been part of this schooled society. Even if they don't overtly take that away, there is an understanding that they're all bonded through that. Now, Benedict Anderson is talking about bonding in terms of nationalism. So bonding in terms of citizens of a shared political entity, of a political community or a political nation. But if we take that a little further, we could talk about the schooled society. We're sharing, we're bonding over our experience as students within an institutionalized formal education system that is, in many ways, much stronger than political affiliation because it is less questioned. It is more taken for granted. Okay, so we've done a lot to conceptualize globalization so far in these screencasts. We've looked at different ways of thinking about globalization and contextualization. We've looked at different outcomes of it. We've looked at how an imagined community, and especially this last wave of nationalism from Benedict Anderson, can add to that understanding. You also have quite a bit of reading that you've been able to do through the Boley and Lechner book. And you will have noticed that I've asked you to read all of part 1 in Lechner and Boley, and that I've asked you to look specifically at some of the questions on page 45, which they do a nice job of providing summary questions at the end of each part. And it's what I've simply done on the next few slides here, and these slides are available to you on our course site, so you can look at these at your own leisure. You don't have to pause the recording. You can just go look at the slides. But what I've done is they just have question 1, right? But I've broken it down because in each of the questions they have several questions that they've asked as well. And what I would like for you to do is I'd like for you to think through what some of the answers are about these questions, but I'd also like you to be a little more critical in how you approach it. So think about what they're actually saying and try to find how you might question what's going on in each of these different chapters that are being addressed. One way that you can do that is to look in your syllabus. I happen to have a copy of the syllabus right here. There's our CIE 401. And you'll note or remember that in the back there is the optional weekly reading memos. I suggest that the potential application and potential problems sections of the weekly reading memos would be a great way to spur some discussion on our discussion board. So remember, one of the things that I'm asking you to do for this week is to watch the screencast, do the readings, and then engage each other on the discussion board. Well, use these questions from Lechner and Boley on page 45 about each of the short chapters in part 1. Look at the answers to these questions. Use these as a foundation, but then I would like for you to think of what are some potential applications or potential problems. You've got your critical hat on. Critical doesn't always mean finding problems. Critical means being critically aware of what's being said, not taking for granted what the authors are saying in each of these chapters. And we have a range of perspectives that are offered, from those who are very much in favor of globalization or putting a positive spin, Micklethwaite and Woolridge come to mind, to those who are being much more critical, like Barber. Right? And I'd like for you to go to the discussion board, and in fact I'm requiring you to go to the discussion board and post some comments about how you would apply these concepts from the readings or how you might problematize them using these questions from our readings as a jumping off point. And to add to that, since we don't have specific questions from the Baker reading, I've created some here, so take a look at that as well. I'll be available by email for the whole week, so please let me know if you have any questions. In the meantime, work on week 3.